Hello, my name is Peter Anson, and what I'm going to be doing with this episode is discussing the Aerosoft Lightning, and in particular the sort of handling and how to fly it correctly, so to speak, because I've seen a lot of videos of people flying the Aerosoft Lightning but not flying it correctly, whether it's going over speed or whether the takeoffs or whether the landings have just been outright bad. So there will be this sort of discussion of flying it sort of properly, cruising it, and then maybe as well a discussion on navigation systems, and briefly discussing how they work as well, and some of the things and the more intricacies within the aircraft. So the particular variant that I'm flying in this example is an early one, the Lightning F1. Here you can see a 74 Squadron with Firestreak missiles. So, being the initial variant, in this case it has the cockpit of the F3 for simplicity, being that there are very few pictures of the F1 and the F2 cockpit. To discuss the cockpit and just point out what there is, here we'll start from the back right. Here you have the oxygen, it's already on, and that's a pretty important thing to have here. You've got the identification friendly or foe system. Here you have this switch which is about the generator, which you want to switch at normal. This is the isolation start switch, which basically when you want to start the engines you have to have this up, otherwise the engines will not begin. You don't have to bother with this. Here we have the autopilot panel, and this one's pretty important to have, or very convenient to have, being that although you might have TACAN guidance, you'll have to manually control the heading or height through the autopilot. On the right here you have the track and glide, which I won't be discussing in this episode, but that's to involve the ILS. Here we have a control where you can change the sort of bang angle, and then the white part here is rate of ascent or descent. Down here you have the gang bar, which in the current state by pressing shift 2 you can see that I've clicked it at clear to start. I'm not going to go through the whole startup checklist, that's something you can follow yourself. It's just that the engines are currently off, and I'll start them shortly once going through the familiarization of the cockpit. But however, this sort of gang bar is for a quick start. As you can see, it says rapid start, you click that and they all switch up. Now discussing here, you have some of the lights. So the taxi light when it comes to taxiing, the different forms of external lights. These two switches are not functional. And then here you have the arm and the safe. So pairs is whether you want to fire 2 red top or Firestreak missiles at the same time, whether you want to just do it singly. Arm and safe, that's of course the master arm, whether you wish to fire. Then here you have a knob between the RB is not functional, however there's guided weapons, and then there's guns is the option. The F3 does not have a gun, so in that case you can only fire guided weapons, but with the F1 you have both the gun and guided weapons. Here you have some internal lighting switches if you choose to fly by night, being that the Lightning is an all-weather aircraft. Here, on the right here, you have various indications. If it's illuminated, something's not right. Now, looking up here, there's these two switches which are quite interesting. I'm going to enable the telebrief button, which is actually a connection to the external power, a small workaround, so to speak. Now, on the right here, you have the AC reset, which is more a flight simulator workaround, whereby in flight simulation, with the Lightning, you can put the throttle in a position called the fast idle, which we can't do with the flight simulator, whereby it will keep the RPM above 60% RPM, which will keep the generators online. Otherwise, if it goes below that, then the generators will fail to function. So by clicking that, that's a sort of workaround. And here, of course, you can see these are the engine RPMs. As far as it goes, when you're flying in the air, as I said, you want to keep it above 60% RPM, or at least one of the engines. But in terms of effective power, it's sort of from about 68, 69% RPM. That will actually make a difference. Then, of course, above here we have the actual fuel tanks themselves. The ventral tank being the sort of bulbous aspect right here, and then the main tanks, which is generally contained in the wings. Now here we have the transfer, whether you want to transfer fuel from the right side of the wing to the left side of the wing. This only functions once all the fuel in the ventral tank's been used. The reason why this is important, aside from an emergency fuel transfer, is because of the fact that if you're doing something like formation flying at low speed, you can't have both the engines at something like 70-80% RPM. I found it easier with formation flying to idle one of the engines and then fly by one other, and then you can actually keep an effective compromise of speed. Now, right, okay, so we move on here and we come across to this display. This is the sort of navigation display, so to speak, and most of the time that I'm flying it, there will be two that I will be looking at, and this is the approach setting, which is once you've put into the TACAN panel, which is just this here, which is the equivalent of VOR, you can put in a runway marker. As you can see, it's swiveling round, and once you've connected that in the ILS, you can use that to guide yourself down. Now, the second one is TACAN, and this will basically tell you the distance of TACAN relative to you and the direction that it is in. Discussion of that as well with the TACAN is that there are two switches. There's air-to-air and air-to-ground. Air-to-air will just tell you distance, it won't tell you direction. So if you put it air-to-ground, it will tell you the direction as well. Although it's spinning right now, so there might be a small error with that, so I'm going to leave it for now. But here you have the heading controls, such that once you have the autopilot engaged, through heading, wherever you point that, the aircraft will steer towards. Of course, this is the artificial horizon. The circle here with the lines is the flight director as well. Then if we move on to the left here, you can see here that this is called the altitude, which you can adjust through this. And then here is an example. This is the vertical speed indicator. It is worth saying that it's not actually, the numbers are not representative, so if it's pointing at 1,000 feet of descent, it will probably be more. As you can see, we're not ascending or descending, and it's slightly above 0. So the best thing to do, particularly with the F3, is actually corrected in the F6 variant, is that you hover over that and it will tell you the vertical speed indicator. Of course, here we have another altimeter and another artificial horizon. Now, this tape here, which is a relatively important one, is of course you have knots above and then the speed of sound below. If we look up here, we've got the optical display, which we can switch on later, which will sort of come online whether you're choosing to fire at a target, and that can give some information that you might require. Moving left here, this is dysfunctional, and then this is a sort of floodlight that you can use whether you want it to be bright or dim, and so forth. It's a three-way switch. When it comes to landing, you have the tail chute, which you pull that, or you can map it to a control if you look into the manuals, and that will help you in stopping. And then once you've reached a sufficiently low speed, you can press the chute jettison button, which will release you from that. Moving down here, we have a variety of other controls. You have the landing gear lever, which interestingly with the Lightning you put up if you want a high performance takeoff, because of the fact that due to the acceleration it's better that the gear goes immediately up. Of course, here we have the flap switch, we have the landing gear indicator as whether it's changing, and then down here we have the trim indicators. As you can see, as you zoom in here, you've got the abbreviation of takeoff, and this is, if you just change your trim down that's what we'll be doing at takeoff, and I'll discuss takeoff shortly once we start the engine. This is the master gyro button, which is also very important. Then looking forward here at the actual stick, the most interesting button you'll have is the AP button, and we'll be discussing that later as well once we're up in the air. Unfortunately the engine's not running, so I can't move the stick right now, but ultimately behind here you've got the UHF, and then you've got ILS settings as well. There's not that much that is functional underneath here. If you wish to remove the stick, you can press that button. However, you also want the stick so you can actually click the autopilot selection. Now, talking about the TACAN in further detail, there's a switch behind here that will switch it on and off. And these four knobs, the two upper ones are to increase the setting, this one by tens and this one by singular digits. However, the lower ones reduce it accordingly, back to 0. There is a conversion chart, if you press Shift 5, here of the numbers and what they mean in VOR. Here is a button as well, which is whether you choose to raise or lower your seat. However, you can do this directly through your keyboard by pressing Shift Enter or Shift Backspace, which is something you will need to use within Lightning. Sorry, going back to the TACAN as well, however, you'll find that Sometimes, if you look at the chart closely on the VOR, what happens if you end up with a frequency of 134.45? Now, the workaround here is that this, if you click that, will give the alternative and the one in between, so you can still get the full range. Of course, we have the throttles here as well, which can go all the way up, and then they push as you go into afterburner. Moving them back, if you click the blue part here, that will cut the engine. In the air, if the engine's shut down, you have the relight buttons, although you shouldn't need to use them, so to speak. And then here we have this sort of handle here, which is to control the radar. And this switch underneath is to switch on the radar. I've mapped this all onto my throttle and stick, and so to be honest, I end up using it away from that, so I can't necessarily speak in detail about the particular controls. Although, being that the radar is relatively simple, so to speak, it's worth just reading in the manuals what each control does. Of course, here you've got a stopwatch, and that will sort of go around accordingly. I don't think I need to say that much about that. Then you have the flight refuel button, which for some reason works in the F1 despite the fact that it doesn't have a refueling probe. And as far as Aerosoft has coded it, is as long as you're in a certain proximity of an aircraft, and it's at a certain speed within a certain band of altitude, you click that and that will that will fill up the fuel given time. Now, talking about the canopy, it's closed right now, and so I'm just going to open it right now. Okay, that's done that in a strange way. Just to sort of talk about the opening and closing procedures, because if you do not lock the canopy correctly, then what's going to happen is that on takeoff the canopy is going to blow off. Here's a nice effect as well: when you raise the canopy, a ladder comes up as well, which is rather sweet. Of course, you've got these handles as well for ejects. Basically, all that does is it offers whether you want to close the simulator or not, or you're done with your flight. Right, so I'm going to click that. The canopy is going to come down and lock. Right, okay. So we click that in. Of course, there's these two switches as well if you've got engine fires and whatnot, but you won't really end up having to switch that. Now, as well with the radar scope, there are two options. You can either open it like that, and you can have a look down if you use something like Track IR, or behind here there's an invisible button, if I can find it again, which will hide it. I've actually mapped that onto my throttle and stick as well, to make life a little bit easier. If I had Track IR, then I probably wouldn't remove it. Right, now, in discussion of starting the aircraft at this point is actually very simple. And as long as you keep the telebrief button on, you don't have to worry about battery consumption. So all I have to do here is press the engine start buttons. And you'll see here that the RPM will generally increase. It generally tends to sit at around 20 to 30% RPM, and that's when the engine sort of started, and then after that you'll push the throttles forward and they will settle. Points to make as well with the Lightning is that the seat right now, this is a sort of convenient angle during flight perhaps, but at landing with proper approach speeds you will not be able to see. So it's generally worth bolstering your height a little bit in that, which is perfectly fair to do. You can see now, sorry I'm wrong with the RPM, it's 30 to 40. Now the parking brake's on, I'm just going to push throttles forward and I'm going to get them to sit just above 60% RPM. And that's the kind of point where you start having effective throttle and the generators will start coming into play. I've got the parking brake engaged as well. The thing is as well is that once you're above 60% RPM, then you have effective throttle control. It's a bad idea to reduce the throttle of your engines all the way, because the instant that you start asking for more power, it's very slow. However, the advice that I can give to that is that if you're in that situation where the throttle is at a low sort of control, then, not low control, but at low RPM, it is better to push the throttle far forward because the engines will be far more responsive. However, if you push the throttle up by an inch, or you want it to reach something like 80 to 90% RPM, it will take its time getting there. So that's a sort of note to make. So I'm going to disconnect the telebrief now, and we are going to prepare for takeoff. As you can see, as you may remember, I changed the trim such that the elevator is now at the takeoff position. Then we put the flaps down. Now, discussing the actual takeoff as well, I said the fact that you put the gear lever up beforehand. In the takeoff roll itself, with the Lightning F1, you will start pulling back progressively at 150 knots and find that the aircraft will start unsticking at around 175 knots, and from there you'll start sort of flying. Now, the idea is that once you're off the ground, the gear comes up automatically. You will know the gear lever will go down in case you end up tail striking the aircraft as well, so be cautious of that and don't pull too aggressively. You just have to let the aircraft accelerate. As well, of course, you need to put up your flaps very, very quickly. Even if you cut out afterburner and you go at maximum dry thrust, it's a concern to have. Right, okay, so we've discussed those aspects, and so we can think about takeoff. In this case, right now I am at RAF Coningsby, although if I want to be historically accurate, I should be at something like RAF Coltishall, which was where this particular Lightning, in the sort of livery that it is in, was at the time. As you can see, by having my engines at this sort of position, I've already burnt 3% of my fuel, which is rather notorious. My rudder pedals have had some issues as well, so if it swerves a little bit, forgive me. Although, to remember as well with the Lightning is it doesn't actually have nose wheel steering, you control it through the brakes. Right, okay, so I've disengaged that. I'm going to bring the throttle up and let it settle towards a higher RPM. I'm going to put the gear up in anticipation, and then now I'm going to let go and I'm going to push it into full afterburner. As you can see right now, because of the fact that I had the throttle above 60% RPM, the throttle response was generally good. I'm coming out 140, 150 knots. I'm going to pull back progressively. And you should hear that the gear lever has come up, although it didn't do it that time, which is unfortunate. And I was pretty sure that I didn't tail strike then. It's sometimes not all too clear. However, if that was an ideal takeoff, which is harder to focus on because I'm speaking to you as well, is that you would take off and then you would level off at about 10 foot above the ground, which I've not done in this case, so I'll have to concede at my own sort of failures. I've throttled back right now because of the fact that the Lightning has pretty incredible acceleration, and if we were just sitting in afterburner, then I'd get through my fuel very, very quickly. So noting about this as well is because of the fact that the Lightning is such an aerodynamically clean aircraft, even at lower RPM the aircraft accelerates very, very quickly. And we will be discussing the Lightning in the cruise, so to speak. As you can see on my right, there is the wash, and we will be climbing up to 36,000 feet. And in that time, sort of discussing the limitations of the Lightning, or the particular variants. As an example, as well with the Lightning, is that if there were fuel in the ventral tank, as you can see, I still have 1,000 pounds left. You could not pull more than 4 Gs. Of course, you can within Flight Simulator, but again, if you're trying to go for realism, after all, we are using something like a simulator, then it's well worth trying to recreate that. Now, again, with the throttle, I'm not using that much above 90% RPM, and as you can see, I'm going about 390 knots, just about to do 400. In the Lightning F1, the constraints were with the aircraft was that it could not go above 650 knots, like all the other variants, and it could not go above Mach 1.7. And I can't tell you why, I don't know, I just knew that that's what its speed restrictions were. It wasn't a lack of power in any sort of sense, because it wasn't that much weaker compared to the F3 and the F6 variants. Now, talking about the other variants as well, the F3 and F6 are very similar capabilities, except the fact that the F6 has a larger ventral tank, so it is far more sort of efficient. Well, sorry, not efficient, but it has a longer reach. In addition as well, they have the option of the inclusion of a gun, where in the front of the ventral tank they've put in ports and guns respectively, because pilots did not appreciate the fact that the F3 was missing the gun. However, as well, on top of that, the F6 had a different wing shape as well, and it had certain kinks at the outer edge, and this gave the aircraft a slightly better low-speed handling, at the cost that, while it could still attain Mach 2, it would take a little longer. But the amount of times that an aircraft would go up to Mach 2 was generally quite rare because of the sheer rate of fuel consumption. Now, the next aspect was, with the Lightning F6, was the fact that it could carry external fuel tanks. And what this meant is that it gave it an additional 4,000 pounds of fuel, which a Lightning F6 with no gun tank, just pure ventral fuel, and over wing tanks, had about 14,000 pounds of fuel. Comparatively speaking, the F1 up to the F3 only had about 7,000 pounds of fuel, so it was a significant increase in range, though it did cost at the element of performance. However, again, it was a useful thing to have. The restraints were of these external fuel tanks was that you couldn't go above 500 or 550 knots, I can't remember, and you couldn't go above Mach 0.9 in those sorts of situations, so they had to be conscientious about that. On top of that as well, they never jettisoned those fuel tanks, so when you were flying the Lightning with the external fuel tanks, you weren't looking for raw performance, so to speak. However, the external fuel tanks, they didn't have any sort of G restrictions, it was still up to the ventral tank, and once the fuel was through with the ventral fuel tank. Right, okay, so here we are, we're already up to 20,000 feet. I've got the engine up to effectively max and dry thrust. There's a little bit more that I can pull out of it. And when you come up to 36,000 feet and you start cruising, you can find out the cruise data if you press Shift 3, which is loading here, and we go to operating data. There's some information which is always very important to use, being especially given the fact that the Lightning was well known for its fuel consumption. And here we've got this, a 2-engine cruise, which is very likely what you'll be looking at. And you either can focus on range or endurance. We're probably going to be looking at range here, where you can see here that if you hold the engines at 83% RPM, you can go at the speed of 0.88 Mach, and this will get you the furthest and be the sort of most efficient cruise in that sense. However, endurance is a different game. And this discusses this at different altitudes, the speeds you should take in RPM. And as you can see here, 12.7 nautical miles for 100 pounds, which frankly is a bit terrible, but it helps, nonetheless. Of course, you have all this information here, which are the checklists and whatnot, and I seriously recommend that you read it, because it will make your flying a lot easier. So as you can see now, we're still sort of climbing up past 25,000 feet. I'm not using any afterburner in the climb, and I'm already nearly through my ventral fuel tank. So I've got about 3/4 of my fuel left. However, if you remember as well, though, with it generally takes a lot more fuel to get to altitude, and then once you're cruising, it takes a lot of time to actually get through the fuel from there. So, you know, again, we're still just sort of going up, and actually I didn't realise about my speed is that I'm going too fast. Generally you want to sit around the cruise in the sort of region of Mach 0.85 and whatnot, and admittedly if I was flying the most efficient sort of climb profile, I would be going slower than this. So I'm just going to point up, just exchange some altitude for speed right now, because I don't need all of this performance. If you're interested as well, this is recorded through Prepared 3.4 with Orbix England, some various sorts of shader mods that I've come across on Facebook, and Rex as well as this sort of thing. So that's discussing that aspect as well. And you know, this is meant to be autumn right now, so of course you get a little bit more punch out of the Lightning in terms of performance, because it's a little bit colder as well, which you can't blame. So now we're up to 33,000 feet. We're nearly at our cruising altitude for flight. And again, as I've said about this flight, is that we're not looking to burn fuel or reach the sort of limits, because again, that's very easy to do, and the next thing that you find yourself doing is that you've just done a 15-minute flight, which is quite fun, admittedly, but the other thing as well is some of the more interesting things is when you fly the Lightning towards the limits of its range, because it doesn't have significant range as an aircraft. Right, okay, so we're just passing 35,000 feet now, and we're just coming up to 36,000 feet. In this process now I'm going to start cutting back on the RPM, because at this point it's not necessary. And I'm just going to level off for now. I'm not really flying anywhere in particular, I'm just going to stay within sort of sight of Coningsby. And now I'm about 200 feet away from the sort of target altitude, and we'll just keep on making a sort of steady ascent towards that. Once I'm past 35,900 feet, I will level off. Right, okay, so now we're going to start discussing the autopilot, which is a very simple system that does the job for the most part. And right, okay, so we've made 900 feet, and I'm just going to level the aircraft off beforehand, make sure everything's trimmed out, because it's something to keep an eye on. Right, okay, the rudder pedals being difficult, as I pointed out earlier. So the first thing you do with the autopilot is you right click the autopilot setting. Now with the parts that you want, in this case I want to do height and heading, I sometimes just press it around a couple of times just to make sure that it's engaged. Okay, and I'm done. And you can see here now that the aircraft is, while it's ascending somewhat, I've told it to have a vertical speed of 0. So the rate of ascent should be progressively decreasing, which, as you can see here, it's slowly decreasing, and we can correct that climb later on. Now, as you can see as well, I've put it onto heading setting as well, which once you can scroll this across here with the scroll wheel on your mouse, and you'll see here that the aircraft responds. It's worthy of note that you should probably be careful about how much you give a response, or how many degrees off you go, because if you push it all the way across here, then the bank can get quite aggressive. The autopilot can handle it, but in certain conditions you can actually end up bleeding a fair amount of speed. It's quite brutal about its turns. I think perhaps some criticisms of the flight model as well, and this may be because of the fact that this card is meant for the Lightning F3 instead of the F6, is that we're saying that at 83% RPM we should be holding Mach 0.88, and we're at about 87% and we're going 0.86. Perhaps once we've leveled off, we might get a 0.1 or 0.2 Mach more out of it, but ultimately we're cruising fairly efficiently here and flying fairly well. So we'll just let the autopilot sort of level off, and in the meantime we can discuss the radar and the weapon systems. So the first switch to sort of think about is the LF sight, and this will switch on the sight within here. We can't see it right now because there's no reason of it being. Now, to switch on the radar, for people who have not mapped it onto the controllers, you can press this button here. In my case, I've mapped it onto my throttle and stick, so you can see here. Now, discussing this display right now, is a very simple old style one. You can't see more than one target and it only locks onto one target. And let's see, right, okay, so this is actually an unhelpful view outright. If we go across here, you will only see this display if you own TACPAC. You will not, otherwise the displays that you will see is more of this variety, which is cheating, and I don't really want to discuss that. Here is the display that's showing the mile sort of display, or distance. So right now we can see how many targets there are in 10 nautical miles, and in this case it can't find any. Now, as you can see here, this is the radar antenna, which can see up to about 30-40 degrees, and then it can look left or right by 50 degrees. Now, you can look across and change the distances up to 80 nautical miles with this switch. However, again, I've mapped it, and I think the keyboard control is Control Shift 5 or Control Shift 6. So if I flick across here, now we're up to 40 miles, and then if I press it, the other option, then we go up to 80 miles. And in this case, actually, now we can see the aircraft has detected a target. Looking at the data across here, we can see that by the line here is that the aircraft, the antenna is looking slightly down, so the aircraft is below us. The blip is not on the display right now, but this circle here discusses relative velocity, or the closure velocity. So here right now it's about 250 knots, or thereabouts. So we can try and find it, and where it is. And you can see as well that the antenna angle is changing because of the fact that we're doing this turn. And that the information is not U relative to the ground, but literally which direction the antenna is looking. The only problem here is sometimes having to try and find the blip on the display. And I suspect as well that the information that you can get to see whether you're turning the right direction or not is by looking at the scope, at the sort of circle here, and whether it moves down this way or it moves left. As I can see here, it's moving back here, so we're actually going further away from the target. So if I turn back right and see if I can try and bring out the blip, I have to admit though that sometimes, you know, when you oh, right now it's even worse as far as it goes. That's rather annoying. Sorry, so I'll go back, because evidently then it means that the target's in that sort of direction then, and I made a mistake in my sort of calculation, so to speak. As you can see here as well, the ventral fuel tank in the meantime has run out, and we're at cruising altitude and we've got our fuel here. Generally we should start thinking about landing once we're at about 1,200 pounds each side, but again, you know, if you fly this aircraft efficiently, then you can fly on for surprisingly long. Okay, so now we found the blip here, and we can see here that it's about 30 degrees to our left, and again the target is slightly below us. Now if we have a look here, we can start arming the weapons in this sort of time, and I'm not entirely sure whether this aircraft fires Firestreak missiles because it was never made in TAC Pack, but still. So now if I click across here, guided weapons, it says that it's arming. This takes about 2 minutes to arm before you can fire said weapon. Now if we look across here, you can see that the target is just under 50 miles away and at 40 nautical miles. Once this blip goes below that, we'll have to change into the next range setting to follow the target, otherwise we'll lose it. And this is the constraint of the radar and the simple system. Now, despite the fact that we held our heading, we can see here that it's going in a sort of a diagonal path, so to speak. So we can somewhat intercept that. Question is whether we are coming towards it or not. I think correction as well actually is that this is 0 knots closure and that this is 300 knots closure, and so forth, and then that's 600 and then that's 900. So as we continue towards to sort of cruise towards the target, we can find that sort of information from that. I don't think I'm going to look to fire here because the aircraft is too far away and it's going to take a lot of time, and I just largely wanted to discuss some of those systems that were involved. In addition as well, you can do a radar reject, if I remember what the button was, which I can't seem to remember right now, but there's also radar reject control here, which I believe is one of these parts. So you press that, but it's not even letting me, which is rather tedious. Right, okay, so let's see as well actually where this is, and then it's found the target again. Again, we're not going to find that because I want to sort of discuss the landing, and doing a full intercept of this aircraft will take time. Now, the landing of this aircraft is something that I've seen as well, which has been rather shoddily done, I think is probably the way of tactfully saying it. And the reason for that is that I've seen people who have landed the aircraft at 140 knots or 160 knots, all the way up to 220 knots. And, there are notes that I have to say from that there are actually far better things to do, far better ways of landing it. Now as well, I think where I realised as well is that we're actually rather close to RAF Binbrook, which might be quite a fun place to land, given the fact that it was one of the major lightning bases in its time. So we're just sort of turning across here. You can see as well that we've lost quite a lot of speed in trying to do this turn because we're pulling 1.5 Gs. So I think as well the base is somewhere along this sort of entry out into the sea. And RAF Binbrook was a base that operated 5 and 11 Squadron that principally flew F6s as their main sort of aircraft, although there were some trainer birds and some F6 variants as well. Just thinking as well where might be somewhere over there. If I can't find it, then I'll just cut my losses and go back to Coningsby. I mean, of course, a pilot in real life would have the sort of a proper map to actually find where the base is. Ah, no, of course, it's just to my right there. You can see the sort of runway and whatnot. You can do different types of descent, and that's strange. I'm going to switch off the radar because that's an odd glitch. But descent and approach, there are multiple ones that you can do. Now, the fast descent here is that Mach 1.1 or 450 knots, air brakes out, and throttle, or you can do a normal descent. Either way, by having the air brakes out and trying to maintain that speed, the aircraft will fall like a brick. So, we are around perpendicular to the Binbrook airfield. You can just see it there. So I'm going to disengage the autopilot. I'm going to throttle back, and I'm going to try and keep the engine above 60% RPM. You can tell if you've gone below the generator limit because the klaxon will start sounding. Right, okay, so I'm going to put the air brake out, and from here we're going to do a fast descent, so 450 knots, and I'm already going slower than that, so that will mean that I'll plummet even faster, so to speak, as well. Turning across there, you can see the runway there. Now, in terms of weight limit for this aircraft, there isn't really that much to sort of discuss about it. However, if the biggest sort of thing is that if you have more fuel than 1,800 pounds in each wing, then you should fly in the approach at 185 knots and then touch down at 180. But if you're below that, then it's 180 knots approach and 175 knots descent. In this case, I've got more than 1,800 pounds of fuel on both sides of the wing. So in my particular stance, what I'll be doing is I'll be flying an approach of 185 knots and touching down at 180 knots. This will just be a sort of manual landing. There's going to be no sort of autopilot involved with it. You'll find as well when you descend that at high altitude, if you put the throttle at idle, then it will stay slightly above 60% RPM. However, if you are, as you start descending, the RPM naturally falls, and so you have to be conscientious of that and watch that you make sure you don't go below the generator level, because of course then you'll get done by the klaxon, which there's a probability that may happen. Right, okay, so I slightly overshot the runway, but that's no problem. You can see the puppy lights in the distance, and this aircraft will decelerate rather quickly as well. I have to admit, actually, as well, considering I'm recording, the flight simulator is performing rather well. I have no qualm about that whatsoever. I might go slightly low as well to bleed off more speed out of the aircraft. So you can see now that it says that I'm slightly low, and once I put down the flaps and the flaps and the gear, which basically the flaps go down so I can put down the gear because the maximum speed is 280 knots, and then the flaps go down at 240. You'll find that the nose will drop off quite a lot, and you'll have to use quite a lot of trim. So, and you can see here that you may see that my nose is sort of fighting its way down. Now, in this sort of flight attitude, you want to have your speed brake out, and you want to have your throttle, your speed brake as well as your flaps and gear, and this will give you more speed control. While in this attitude, I prefer looking at this gauge for speed and whatnot, and that makes life a little bit easier. If you're flying without speed brake, you'll find that the aircraft is far more sort of slippery to control, and individual throttle responses are somewhat less. As we come across here, once I pass the threshold of the runway, then I will deploy the drag chute. I'll slow down to 180 knots, and then I will deploy the drag chute. So I throttle back now, I push the drag chute, I put the brakes down, and I start descending. And that's the klaxon again, because I forgot to keep one of the engines above 60% RPM. Once I put it back above, then it will quieten down for me. Right, okay. And that was, I pulled the tail chute via a key binding, and then I pressed the chute jettison, and then that is clean. And that is the discussion of the sort of landing, so to speak. When you're on the ground, you'll find quite a few times that your fuel level will tend to be a lot lower than mine, being the fact that I made this a far shorter flight in the region of about 20-25 minutes. Maybe I could have put a timer on it. I had a lot more fuel, in fact over half than what I sort of started, over half to what I originally started with. The notes that you can do here to sort of save fuel is that you can disable one of your engines, because you only really need one engine to taxi, and then you can just transfer fuel from the one fuel tank to the other. So in this case, I have engine number 2 running for taxiing, and you can see here that the fuel now is starting to go through that. So I can press the starboard transfer to send more fuel that way. So this is a freeware scenery as well, Binbrook, which eats my frames a little bit more, but it's rather nice anyway, and it's quite nice to have a sort of a historical airfield and something that goes well with the sort of lightning history, and it's very close to to Coningsby and Marham to have, and I recommend this sort of scenery. I think it was made by Ted Andrews, or at least it has compositions of Ted Andrews, so I think it's very well worth searching those aspects up. I mean, as you can see right now, my frames have dropped off quite a lot now, and I usually end up about 25 frames to 30 in this sort of scenery. Nonetheless, because of the fact that well, you know, I'm recording right now, so I lose some more frames in doing so. I've just forgotten as well that I had the weapons armed, and that took about 2 minutes to do, and then you can click back off there, and I'm going to switch off the LF sight. And because of the fact that I've got quite a lot of fuel, I don't need to shut down my other engine. But again, if I only had about £1,000 in total, or even less than that, then I would shut down one of the engines for fuel efficiency's sake. What else can I sort of discuss? Again, the aircraft doesn't have nose wheel steering, so you control it via brakes, and I'd recommend that you use something like FSUIPC to map out the brakes, to take a sort of exponential sort of style with that, so you can have far more refined control of the steering, because if you've just left it blunt, or your brakes can be somewhat unreliable, then it's very difficult to control it. Here you can see as well, you can see the F6s from 5 Squadron with overwing fuel tanks, and it just sort of stops there. They're carrying Fire Streak, I believe, on them. Binbrook, as some information, was an airfield that was built in the 50s and 60s, and on top of that as well, it was closed afterwards in the late 1980s, when 11 Squadron stopped operating. 5 and 11 Squadron stopped operating the F6. Now I think there's quite a few videos of the sort of final displays, and I think it was 1988 was the sort of final year, 87 or 88, I believe, here, you can see the whole sort of lineup, and I hope someone who went to Binbrook will be able to see the sort of detail respectively. Right, okay, I'm not going to sort of slot myself in the parking because that would just be wasting unnecessary time for now. And effectively, there are not many sort of large notes that I have to make about the Lightning. It's just that a lot of people fly it with little to sort of no respect about it, or no sort of finesse. And it's one of those things as well that is very rare when you see someone fly the Lightning properly that is cruising for a significant amount of time. And I think that's somewhat lacking in the sort of flight simulator sort of scenery of things. But aside from that, the TACAN's fairly simple. It's well worth reading the manuals on that. The manuals are pretty good as well. And here I'm just going to shut down one of the engines here and just sort of begin the sort of shutdown sequence. And yes, in essence, that's what I've got to discuss about the Lightning. I hope that you found those things interesting and informative as well, the information, and I trust that you had a pleasant day.